program, but found his place with the NRCS, where he's worked for a number of years now, and is currently the wildlife biologist, or the state biologist, excuse me, with the NRCS out of Salt Lake City's office. His work these days focuses on sage grouse conservation, on pollinator enhancement, wetland and riparian management and restoration, and environmental compliance. And his talk today is impacts of riparian invasive plant species to native fauna.
Thank you. Forward, backwards, and light.
Yeah, and that one's the chaos button. So
okay, don't touch it.
And there's your mic.
All right, thank you.
Oh, I don't think I, oh yeah, I did.
So, I'm the state biologist for the NRCS in Utah, and a lot of people don't know a lot about the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I'll get a little more detailed at the end if we do have time, but we do work with farmers and ranchers around the state on conservation work, focusing on all types of conservation: soil, water, air, plants, animals, and energy. And as the state biologist, I get to focus on the plants and animals portion of it. And it's a great job. We get to work proactively with people all around the state. And I get to cover all sorts of different habitats and all sorts of different places. But my favorite is working in riparian areas, especially in the more arid parts of the state. And over the years, I've worked a lot with invasive species and invasive species control and more active restoration on these species. And I've come up with a lot of these questions over the years, and I've tried to put this talk together partially for myself to try to answer some of the questions that I've had over the years. And the more you put together, the more questions you get. But I wanted to share this with you guys. It's more of a synthesis of the existing research. I've done a little bit of this myself, the research, but mostly I'm collecting what's already out there to share with you guys. So we're going to talk about native plants versus invasive, non-native plants and invasive plants ultimately. I'd like to start off by pointing to this chart from the eastern US, and I know it's a lot of information and there's more that I had to cut off because there's a whole second page. But this shows Lepidopteran, moth and butterfly, species use by genus of plants in the eastern US again. So you can see up top you've got Quercus and Prunus, and then at number 3 we've got Salix or willows, and Populus at number 5 there, with hundreds of different Lepidopteran species using these trees. And these are a lot of our common native genera in the east and some in the west as well. And then as you go down the list, you see more and more landscaping plants showing up. And I think this was put together to show, to justify native landscaping versus non-native plants for landscaping, but I thought it was a really great kind of large-scale study on all these genera. As you get down towards the bottom, you see Russian olive with 9. There's Tree of Heaven there. And on the next page was Tamarisk with 3. I just thought it was funny because butterfly bush had 1. So I thought that was worth noting as well. So it's just an interesting kind of framework which we're starting to look through here before we zoom down into some of the specific invasive species we deal with in the West here. These native plants are critical for pollinators, for invertebrates in general, and ultimately for wildlife, and in some cases for the functionality of our ecosystems. 35 times higher production of butterflies and moths on native versus non-native plants, and 4 times the overall herbivore biomass on these plants as well. This is from the same study as the previous slide. You kind of look at it as the food pyramid. You've got the plants at the bottom, and the invertebrates and the kind of the things that are feeding on the plants, and leading up to the fewer larger animals that those support. So I'm looking at native plants as the primary supporter of the invertebrates that other species then rely on as food sources. 90% of all herbivorous insects eat only plants native to their region. So moving up that triangle, that pyramid a little bit, we get to birds, and I just wanted to highlight here what percentage of birds, and it's broken down by bird order, are feeding on primarily insects, partially on insects, and then non-insectivorous birds. And you can see that the summary of this column, I like to move around, but I'll move around and talk loud. I'll just pop over for a second. I'll be right back. I like to point with my finger. See, you can see 61% overall of all the North American bird species are actually primarily feeding on insects. And again, those insects are primarily being fueled by native plants. 28% are partially insectivorous, and only 11% are not. And I'd like to highlight the last row there, the perching birds, the songbirds, the passerines, which are a lot of the birds that we're familiar with, are primarily a high percentage, 90% almost, insectivorous birds. And it's not just ecosystems. I wanted to throw this in quickly because I thought this was also additional justifying support for why native plants are important to support invertebrate populations that support wildlife populations, pollination benefits, $3 million in the US, integrated pest management benefits, these are all from insects, integrated pest management benefits, $4.5 billion. And then what I thought was really interesting was this recreational benefits is almost $50 billion. And they took the types of recreation, hunting, fishing, and wildlife observation that are utilizing, that are observing species or hunting species that are utilizing insects, and they came up with that $50 billion figure. So just another food for thought in why this is all important. So of course, bam, here come the invasive species. This is a chart just showing their spread across the country over time and space. And we all know that, you know, there's more than there used to be, and they're potentially a bigger problem than ever. If we focus on sensitive species for a second, Fish and Wildlife Service, the federally listed species, 42% identify invasive plant species as at least one of the causes of declines of these species. 68% of plants highlight invasive species as an issue. 28% of birds. The second leading cause of decline for T&E species after actual habitat loss or degradation. So, why is this all happening? How has it all happened? I'm no evolutionary, ecologist here, but these plants and these insects have co-evolved over time together. The invertebrates have evolved to utilize these plants, to support their life cycle. Invasive plants are lacking herbivores, lacking diseases that sometimes come with them in their home territory. And the idea of biodiversity of plants and of animals is important because when you get monocultures, you're getting potential eruptions of pests and disease, and we want to try to avoid that. And not only in wildlands, but in backyards and agricultural landscapes, the more diversity you have, the less potential you're going to have for disease and pest issues in general. And not only are there direct effects to the food web, but there's also indirect effects to the ecosystem processes. When you have more invasive plants and more monocultures, you affect nutrient cycling, hydrology, sometimes the fluvial geomorphology, and the fire regimes of the systems. And we're going to dig into these more with individual invasive species. So I think I hit most of that already. So ecosystem processes, this is just one example, and this isn't even a riparian example, but it was one that I had readily at hand. This is a state and transition model from one of the NRCS's ecological site descriptions, and there's a lot of information on here, but I'm looking at this red box, and this is a fire-tolerant shrub invasive plant state. So this is when you're getting a lot of cheatgrass in the system. And really, the ecosystem processes are fueling more fires and fueling more cheatgrass, and you really kind of the plants are fueling the hijacking of the whole ecosystem at that point. And that's just one kind of example that we have diagram that I wanted to share with you. So in general, we're looking at conflicting results, lots of different studies out there. It depends on where you are. It depends on the matrix of plants and habitats that you're surveying. But in general, increased invasive species trends towards lower wildlife diversity, richness, and abundance. Effects vary, of course, again, by wildlife type, and results from studies are often, it's hard to extrapolate them to the whole western US or to all invasive species in general. Sometimes you have to look at the actual study and see how it sits on the landscape and what some of the other variables are in that study. But in general, we're looking at decreased diversity, richness, and abundance of wildlife. Invasive species are not always poor habitat. I'm definitely not saying that. If you get a mixed riparian forest that has healthy cottonwoods, willows, and then there's a tamarisk here and a Russian olive there, that's fine. But the problem is it doesn't stay that way. You know, a lot of them over time trend towards more invasives and less natives. These species eventually alter the structure of the plant communities. They limit the diversity, and a lot of times we're looking at, well, cottonwood or tamarisk or willow or Russian olive, but really when you have the cottonwoods and you have the willows, a lot of times they're supporting a lot of other associated native species, herbaceous species that go along with that, whereas when you get to the tamarisk and you get to the Russian olive dominated systems, you're eliminating a lot of that other plant diversity as well that obviously supports animal diversity along with it. But you must always consider what the alternative is to your invasive species. You know, a lot of times we see it, we want to go cut it out and kill it, but you have to ask yourself, what can we plant or what can grow naturally in the place of that plant? And sometimes the answer is you don't know, and sometimes I think it might not be easy to grow something else there, and then you have to start asking yourself, what should I be doing? All right, Tamarisk, AKA salt cedar, a couple different species and hybrids between these species in the US, brought in around 1820, and in the 1800s was widely available in seed catalogs in nurseries around the US, promoted for windbreaks and stream bank stabilization. It is controlled a bit by hard freezes. That's why it's probably more common in the Southwest than it is in kind of the northern part of the West. Although different species of tamarisk and different hybrids seem to be more cold tolerant, and there seems to be a growing amount of those that are more cold tolerant. So it's still changing and developing. There's still potentially more expansion of tamarisk, which is hard to imagine. So it's hard to isolate, again, the variables between the changes in the hydrologic regime and the actual effects from tamarisk, because some of the effects to wildlife that you're seeing in these systems are also affected by the changes in the hydrologic regime, which is also promoting the tamarisk in a lot of cases. So here's a map of counties with tamarisk in the western US, and you can see we're pretty thoroughly covered in Utah. I think I see Morgan County with a little white spot in there, but I bet you I could go find a tamarisk in Morgan County. Maybe I will and give them a call. But Utah, you can see Utah, Arizona, Nevada. It's really the Southwest that's the biggest, I think it's the biggest hotspot for tamarisk invasion. And then around the world, it's also an issue. It's native to Southern Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Mediterranean basin. So in these areas, theoretically, it's mostly native, but you get a lot of these other areas around the world besides the US where it's also an invasive species. Interesting study here, the frequency of riparian plants in the western US. Sandbar, which is coyote, narrowleaf, sandbar willow, Salix exigua, is the most commonly found plant when you're walking in the riparian areas in the west. Cottonwood is number 2, but then tamarisk and Russian olive are 3 and 4. And then in terms of cover, tamarisk is number 2 and Russian olive is number 5, and we'll get to Russian olive here in a minute as well. So some people say, wow, look at all the bees on that tamarisk. This is great. Honeybees, colony collapse. This is gonna be great. Well, yeah, you know, it's from Eurasia. Honeybees are European honeybees. Yeah, they like it. It flowers for a long time. I'm not going to argue with folks on that. It certainly has value for honeybees, but a lot of native bee species aren't found using it, and a lot of insects are not found in it, and a lot of less diversity in this one study. Especially if you compare it to willows, which are important larval host plants for a lot of butterflies and moths, and are important to early flowering, pollinating, early flowering species for pollinators. So, and then Tamarisk leaf litter, as compared with Fremont cottonwood, had a 50% decrease in stream macroinvertebrate richness, where it was the primary source of leaf litter in the aquatic environment, and then a 75% decrease in overall macroinvertebrate abundance. So, it's affecting the aquatic environment as well as the terrestrial and riparian areas. 2008 study on birds, this is from Arizona. Species richness of birds was highest in cottonwood intermittent stream sites, cottonwood perennial stream sites, and mesquite intermittent stream sites. Within these intermittent stream sites, there were an average of 19 to 20 fewer bird species in Tamarisk versus cottonwood and mesquite. Yes, they're there. You'll see them in Tamarisk. They're using it, but your diversity is going to be lower. And Tamarisk and intermittent flow regimes contain no unique species compared to cottonwoods. Well, cottonwood had 20 unique species compared to Tamarisk. So again, it's supporting species, more generalist species. You're getting more specialist species in these cottonwoods, in willows in some cases as well. And you had lower bird richness in the Rio Grande and lower Colorado compared to cottonwoods. Higher bat activity above cottonwoods compared to Tamarisk in Arizona. And that makes sense if you think about bats. They're foraging on insects, a lot of them on moths at night or other insects, which are obviously more drawn to be using cottonwoods versus Tamarisk, like we already talked about. And then also bats, a lot of species will roost under cottonwood bark, so it provides some structure for them as well. And then Tamarisk removal led to significantly higher desert pupfish populations in Nevada, and along with that, it lowered the invasive crayfish populations when the Tamarisk was removed and native plant species were grown in its place. Water studies. This is an interesting component, and from the time I started doing Tamarisk removal and riparian restoration, when I started in 1999 with the BLM in the Mojave Desert, and up until very recently, not everybody, but a lot of people still push it's going to save you water, and it's a great way to get funding for your project if you say it's going to save water. But based on everything that I've read recently and the most recent information, that evapotranspiration of Tamarisk is about equal to cottonwoods and willows, but you do have often a wider, more aerial coverage, wider riparian zone that Tamarisk can occupy versus the cottonwoods and willows, which would lead you to think, well, maybe it's still using more water. But there's been no definitive studies that have shown long-term increases in in-stream flows. So I'm not saying it's not true, but nobody's been able to prove it yet. And you always get that short-term bump. You go out, you cut out your Tamarisk, you cut out your Russian olive, heck, you cut out your juniper. There's less water being used, and you see your springs, flow higher, or you see potentially higher in-stream flow in the short term. But over the long term, it hasn't been proven yet. So hasn't been disproven, I guess, either. So we'll see. So dominance of Tamarisk may be attributable to stream intermittency and regulation. So that's part of the reason that you see so much of it. It's more of a result of the changes that we've had to the hydrology and our hydrographs and our systems in the West. But also, it's a positive feedback loop. So it's kind of fueling these cycles in some cases where It narrows channels because of its density. It contributes potentially to down cutting in some areas. You're not getting your high flows spread across your floodplain and your infiltration of water into the system. It's more fast and off-site. So sometimes it feeds into the system that makes it more suitable for more tamarisk and its long-term persistence on the landscape. So just a quick rundown, I'm not going to go through this, but here are the priority 1, 2, and 3 species from the Utah Wildlife Action Plan that rely on lowland riparian, mountain riparian, and flowing water, and all of these species could be potentially affected by tamarisk. I'm not going to get into the details. Southwestern willow flycatcher is one that's kind of a hot topic with tamarisk right now. Its preferred natural nesting habitat, at least, is in cottonwood with dense willows. It will also nest in mixed willow tamarisk habitat, and it'll also nest in tamarisk monocultures. So, okay, well, that's not bad, but then we get the tamarisk beetle, and in the short term, we're seeing a really changeover in the density of some of our riparian habitats as the tamarisk dies out, but before we've gotten any regrowth of any of our native riparian species. Fish and Wildlife Service is concerned in the short term with the potential drops in flycatcher habitat. A bird that lives 2 to 5 years, having this amount of habitat defoliated before the willows can grow back is a serious concern in the short term. Hopefully in the long term, we're on the right track with all this though. Fire in tamarisk, short-term increase with the tamarisk beetle because you have more dead material on the landscape, but hopefully in the long term, you'll have a decreased fire risk because you'll have more riparian plants growing in the system. Here's some beetle-killed tamarisk. This is what I'm really concerned about, are these areas, large patches of higher elevation floodplain areas with dead tamarisk, and all that's growing underneath them in some of these areas is Russian knapweed. You're not getting natural regeneration until you get a flood with some deposition or erosion of this area to really reset the system, but that's a lot less likely in some of our systems than it used to be. That yellow box, here's one option of what you can do, is chop it all up, but you get rabbit brush sprouting again. So, I'm not here to talk about restoration, but it's, we're dealing with some issues here where we don't have good habitat. Good habitat's not readily coming back in the short term, and it's going to be a big issue to figure out how we're going to deal with this. Russian olive, brought to the U.S. in the 1800s for hedgerows and shade. It was encouraged by state and federal agencies until very recently, and may still be in some areas. It's a little bit more cold hardy. It needs some cold stratification for seed germination and for bud break. You can see in Utah alone, you can see this gradient. In southern Utah, you've got tamarisk that's the dominant invasive species, and in northern Utah, it's kind of transitions to Russian olive. It's fire tolerant, it's shade tolerant, it's salinity tolerant, it's tolerant of a wide variety of soil conditions, and it enjoys regulated rivers and long walks on the beach. So it's got a broad ecological niche, breadth of what it can tolerate, which is kind of why it's so successful, I think. Again, you can see all of Utah and a lot of the West is habitat for this species. Influences the composition and structures of the communities it invades. It may widen the extent, like tamarisk, of the woody riparian area, because it is tolerant of more conditions than cottonwoods and willows may be. It may alter succession. But bird species richness and diversity in this one study were lower in native riparian. Bird species richness and diversity were lower in Russian olive than in native riparian habitat, although mammal richness was higher in this one study. I did read a critique of this study that said, well, the Russian olive site was next to some diverse grassland habitat, so it may have an influence from that. But anyway, 9 of the 29 species of birds nesting in the Gila River use Russian olive. More bird foraging guilds in winter in willow versus Russian olive. In breeding season, bird richness, abundance, and density were higher in willow versus Russian olive. And cavity nesting birds were almost completely absent. they're not excavating, woodpeckers aren't excavating holes, and secondary cavity nesters aren't obviously using them because there's no holes. In Montana, undisturbed colonizing and establishing cottonwood communities supported a variety of other native plant species, like I mentioned earlier, versus Russian olive dense stands only supported 29 other plant species. Herbivorous insect richness was significantly lower in Russian olive versus cottonwood. And the only species benefit that they found that actually seemed to benefit from Russian olive versus native riparian habitat was mourning dove. So again, that generalist, we're supporting some generalist species, but we're losing some of our specialist species. This is awesome. Insect densities, well, it sucks, but it's awesome stat here that insect densities in Russian olive were, what's this, 15 times lower pretty much than in coyote willow. May contribute additional nitrogen to the system, and it may change the plant community. This is a big one because riparian habitat, Russian olive adding to it is one thing, but when you take, this is riparian habitat with Russian olive coming in, but when you take these wet meadows and you get Russian olive in these habitats, which are important for a lot of other sensitive species, you're changing the habitat type altogether. And you're getting invasion of woody plants into areas that didn't have it before. And you have a lot of wet meadow and wetland species that are not tolerant of this woody material in there. Plus sage grouse would be using these areas and are not tolerant of taller structures in there. All right, Arundo. All right, wrap this up with Arundo. We only have this in one place in Utah, but it's very common in the southwestern U.S., known as giant reed, native to Asia. It's not cold tolerant. It is limited how far it can get into Utah by cold temperatures. We do have it in Washington County. I recently found some in San Juan County on the San Juan River as well. So it's something to watch out for in the southern part of the state. There's no nesting structure on Arundo. It's a giant grass. The only species that nest in it, as far as I know, is hummingbirds because they're small enough to put their nest against the leaf and the stalk, but nothing else can really nest in there. It fuels fire regimes in riparian systems. It impacts cuckoos, it impacts flycatchers. A whole host of other sensitive species are severely or highly impacted by Arundo. I mentioned the nest structure. Fire danger, hollow tubes, when they heat up, they pop, they spread fire in riparian areas instead of creating fire buffers in riparian areas. When it burns, it's a grass, it just regrows right away and further outcompetes other species in the area. All right, so to wrap this up, there's a lot to think about. Is control or eradication feasible? That's your first question. At what cost? What can you get to grow in place of the invasive species? Can the site support native plants? Are invasive species the limiting factor for the wildlife species of concern or for other wildlife species? What are the long-term and short-term and on-site and off-site effects to species from doing this? But for the most part, if you can actually control these invasive species and get native species to reestablish and persist, it's certainly a good thing, but it's not always going to be the easy thing to do on the landscape. There are certain situations I've encountered in the past where we've just said, we're not going to do this. We can't get anything else to grow in the Mojave River besides these scattered tamarisks. If we take these out, we've already got, this is the second floor of a house, and this is windblown sand. So, for other social reasons, and if there's obviously other considerations out there on the landscape, we had to decide to leave that out there. So NRCS, it's awesome. That's why I put it at the end so I could skip it if I ran out of time. We are available for technical assistance and potential financial assistance for private landowners all across the country for invasive species control and all other sorts of conservation activities. We do have an invasive species list on our website that not only covers the noxious weeds in the state, but a whole host of other potentially invasive species. It's available on our website. And there's my information. Thank you. Okay. Wait, I have time for the final thought. Okay, this is a snarky final thought. This was emailed to me by somebody that I worked with in California. And this applies not only to my talk, but I think to a lot of different things. And I asked him, should we do this or shouldn't we do it? And he said, well, it depends. It depends on all these things. And that's true for, a lot of what we do when we're managing wild areas and life in general. So that's kind of my summary final thought. Questions?
We have time for one question. And then
Yes.
So as far as the Tamarisk and defoliation, what's your thought? How long does it take before you think it starts fading out of the system for good?
Well, it's based on my observations and some stuff I've read. If the Tamarisk is getting a fair amount of moisture, it's fairly resilient to the beetle. I've seen it resprout 6, 7 years still. It keeps coming back. It dies back, and you'll see basal resprouts coming back because it's getting enough water. These higher, drier areas, which is 90% of probably the surface area on the ground we're talking about, they're knocked out in a year or two usually, and we've got dead Tamarisk skeletons and a lot of fuel and not a lot of habitat in those areas. So it depends. It depends.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.